and McCann.
Greetings. Welcome to Wake the Dead. Today, we are very delighted to bring researcher, activist, and fellow anarchist Derrick Broze to the program. Welcome, Derrick.
Thanks for having me on, and I appreciate you.
Awesome. You are doing some wonderful work right now, and regarding many topics, and I've been tuned in to everything you've been working on for quite some time now. I've been following your work for a long time, and I have found that I can trust your opinion. You are a caring, intelligent individual, and you drive towards the truth and towards care. And so I'm very happy to show everybody, to introduce all of my listeners to you. You have been on our show. I used to do another show with my brother James, and it was called Black Pill Digest. You were there for one episode. We were talking about health topics, and fluoride was one of the things that we spoke about. And fluoride, the fluoridation of water, is one of your main focuses at this moment. There is currently, it started in 2020. I guess 2016, is that when it started? There is a trial in the courts as we speak on the negative effects of fluoride in drinking water, and it is being decided if there is a judge deciding whether we should stop fluoridating the water. And this is a miraculous occasion because it's happening within the government confines, where the toxicology, what was it? There was an act where citizens can bring cases to the government and say, this is toxic and we need to remove it from the public to keep people safe. And this is like a miraculous thing, because I mean, how could the government even approve that to begin with? And so this gives the opportunity for citizens to bring the case of fluoride to the government's attention, to the people's attention, and to say, this is toxic and it should no longer be added to our water. And since the 1930s, there have been doctors testing this and showing that fluoride is a toxic substance. And only now, in 2020, I guess the first part of the trial wrapped up, and even then the government blocked it by saying the judge said we should see this report, and we'll wait for the report to be released. And the government blocked the report. It was just, no, you can't know the truth. And now there's a second part of the trial, and it wrapped up in February. You went to San Francisco to be at the trial, to cover this trial, and to interview different individuals that were testifying. You brought lots of wonderful information, and people can find that at thelastamericanvagabond.com. We will share a link with everybody. They can actually find it down below as they're listening, to find all of your information that you produced regarding the fluoride trial and what you've learned. Today, I asked you here to bring all this to people's attention about the trial and about the test in pregnant mothers and the results of the IQ level of babies. This is very important information. And for all these years, it's been like a tinfoil hat topic. Oh, you think fluoride's poison, weirdo? And it's just like there's this wall that people have, and a lot of people don't look into it. So here, this is my attempt at bringing this to people's attention. So everybody that knows and can share, please do share this podcast with your friends and family who are still drinking tap water. I mean, it's like my wife's parents, we get in arguments and they laugh at us like we're crazy. And we fill up the coffee containers, the glass, and we hold the water, our distilled water in one and their tap water in the other. The tap water is gray. And they say to us, it's fine. Nah, don't worry. And they're like drinking their coffee every day. And so this is very important for everybody to hear. And thank you again, Derrick. And I apologize for the long intro, but please.
No worries, man. You did a good job summarizing it there. And I definitely can empathize and sympathize with your struggle there, because despite all the work that I do, I definitely still have people in my family who don't pay attention and who drink fluoride. And I've gotten most of them to pay attention and to sort of switch. Like, I'm here in Texas right now visiting my parents, and my mother, she now is doing like alkaline reverse osmosis water and stopped cooking. At first it was funny because it was a transition where they started using that for drinking. But then I would see her still go to the tap and like fill up for her whatever noodles or whatever she's cooking. And I had to like help her understand, like, Mom, like, you don't want to drink it and you don't want to cook with it. Because for those who don't know, actually with fluoride, it's not like some other compounds. When you boil it, you actually, since fluoride is a salt, you actually increase the concentration of the fluoride. The water evaporates, but the fluoride goes into your noodles or your coffee or your whatever you're cooking. So that's definitely another area that we, those of us who care about our health and care about, our brains and our bones and all the different ways that fluoride impacts us, should definitely be paying attention to. So it's not just about the water that you drink, it's the water you cook with, and even more than that, it's the water you shower with. That it gets into some areas that are a little bit more difficult for people to tackle, because water filters can be often expensive depending on what you're trying to do. But I've been all over the United States and even other parts of the world, and most places have these very inexpensive water filtration stations. You'll just find them in parking lots, you'll find them in different places, and most of them I've seen do like 7 different kinds of filtration. So you got carbon, you got this and that, but what you're looking for is reverse osmosis, which is what gets out fluoride. So there are options out there, thankfully. It's just about, as you said as well, trying to get people beyond this is a tinfoil hat topic, you just sound crazy. And I think really that comes back to some of the more fundamental programming that we all face. That what are they really saying? What your parents or your friends are saying is, well, you're not a doctor, you're not a scientist. And I've heard all my life that doctors and scientists say that this is good for me. My dentist puts it in my mouth. So there's no way they can be wrong, because they're the authorities. And who are you? What did you just learn something on the internet? There's these unspoken assumptions that it really comes down to. It's this belief in authority that really underpins a lot of our problems, and especially water fluoridation.
Wow, you could not have said it better. I mean, that's perfect. And as an example, I grew up in Massachusetts in the 80s and 90s, and there they had this thing called fluoride swish, where they would come to the classroom with a little cart and all these little cups of fluoride liquid in it, and they would make us swish it around in our mouth every like week or something. It was, I mean, now I see it as a eugenics, like, they're trying to harm us. Like I came to this realization long before I recognized that fluoride is poison, I guess, that the government is trying to harm us. They use mind control and different methods of making us choose not to find truth, choose what the authority says, like, oh, the teacher brought it to me, it must be good, the teachers, and this my wife's parents, same people have talked about with the, trying to convince them. Like there was one instance where we were talking about the coating on an apple, and she said to us, oh, well, it's put on food, so it must not be harmful. They just assume the government would never. Why? But that's like this show and your show and a lot of the information on the internet proves otherwise. The government is actually harming us, and I guess we can't really prove the motive, but we can see the results. And in every instance, it's you know, attacking our health and our minds and our free will and our conscious decisions. Like it's really a full scale war on us. And as like I was coming up as an anarchist, and that like realizing the truth of anarchy and my and there was this incident in Amesbury, Massachusetts. I don't know if you're familiar with this, but I lived in Newburyport. It's like the next town over. And in 2009, they stopped water fluoridation in Amesbury, Mass. And I can share a clip actually here. There was a gentleman who was the guy in charge of dumping the fluoride in the water. And this is a news report here. I'm going to share it for everybody can hear it.
The water in Amesbury is supposed to have fluoride in it, but Rob Damaris has been concerned for years about what's in the supply he gets from China. The residue you see here is what won't dissolve when he puts the fluoride powder in the water. What is that?
We don't know.
You have no idea what's in there?
I don't know what it is. It's not soluble. And it doesn't appear to be sodium fluoride, so we're not quite sure what it is.
Damaris says the residue clogs his machines and makes it difficult to get a consistent mix. For almost a year, these fluoride pumps in Amesbury have been off, and the water department says they'll stay off until they can figure out what's in the fluoride. The Department of Public Health says more than 650,000 customers in 44 communities are getting the product in question, and only Amesbury has temporarily stopped using it. But despite those concerns, we want to be clear. Both state and federal health officials tell Team 5 Investigates Chinese fluoride is safe. The New York company which supplies the fluoride in question says it is certified by the National Sanitation Foundation, which assures the quality of the product. And despite 1,000 complaints, the Centers for Disease Control also says it's safe, although testing continues to determine the precise composition of the residue.
They should test it to make sure that what they're putting in is safe for us to drink.
Paul Stewart lives in Newburyport and believes he has a right to know exactly what's in his water.
On the same day that I read the story about the fluoride coming from China, I also read stories about the melamine that was being contaminated in the milk products coming from China, that Abercrombie and Fitch actually pulled some of their jewelry off the shelves because it was contaminated with cadmium coming from China. And then we had another story about more lead in kids' toys coming from China.
Since 2007, most of the sodium fluoride has also been imported from China because it's the least expensive on the market.
I don't think that when it comes to something that I ingest every day, the lowest bidder is good enough.
I'd like to be able to add it in, worry-free.
For Team 5 Investigates, I'm Kelly Tutch.
So you'd like to be able to add it in worry-free. What do you think about that, Derrick?
Pretty much all of the different mainstream reports I've seen on fluoride over the years always have a similar tone. It usually has a talking down to anybody who thinks that there's something wrong, and they like to throw in qualifiers like that, like scientifically proven. The other thing people should know about it, the reason I think that there's so much pushback, one of the reasons besides just, they want to continue harming people, is the fact that, like vaccines, the CDC claims that water fluoridation is one of the top 10 public health achievements of the 20th century. So that's still listed on their website, even though everything we're talking about today relating to IQ, relating to liver, to kidney, to impact on mothers and children, like all the things that we now know, they're still ignoring that, and they're still acting like it's the top 10 public health achievement. So anytime you see a mainstream report, or like I've gone to city council and tried to talk to people, it's similar to what we discussed already with trying to talk to your parents or your friends' parents or anything like that. It's just this sort of like pat on the head, only crazy people think that. And it really is designed, I think, to reach people like you're saying, your wife's parents, who they hear you saying something, but then let's say they tune into a program like that and it says, oh, this is worry-free. There's nothing, it's like, oh, okay, yeah, I don't have to worry about that. I knew he was crazy. I can just go back to believing what I believe. And it kind of like, it is programming, not even subtle, but it's so crazy because the psychology behind it is like, you might plant a seed and say, hey, I think fluoride, there's something wrong with it, you should look into it. Maybe they're initially skeptical, but if they did turn to a mainstream report and hear like, hey, the government is studying fluoride and there might be some problems, they might actually listen to you and say, oh my God, maybe he's not crazy, maybe there's something right. But instead they go get a confirmation bias from the mainstream. They already have like an authority bias where they're prepared and ready to accept what someone from a position of authority claims, and they're holding that. So then when you say something, there's like this defensive mechanism, like, no, that can't be true, that can't be true. And then they go to the TV or the internet or whatever, and they hear types of reports like that. And it just reinforces the same thing. It reinforces like, oh, see, I knew I was right. I can just continue to be sure in my beliefs and confirm my biases and ignore and deny anybody who says anything opposite because the TV said it or because the news anchor said it. And sure enough, of course, they can trot out their own quote unquote experts. This is, I think, part of a symptom of the bigger battle of science that we've been facing. And it's been going on with COVID for years and vaccines even prior to, with fluoride and vaccines prior to COVID, but COVID sort of brought it out in terms of they have their experts and we have our experts, right? Because just like you mentioned, I went to the fluoride lawsuit and I interviewed 3 of the expert witnesses who were testifying and the lawyer who were testifying in the lawsuit. But at the same time, the government has their witnesses who are claiming the exact opposite, right? And this is why it gets confusing for the average person, because they can pull out their papers claiming this thing or that thing. And the people on the anti-fluoridation, I would say more pro-freedom of choice side, they have their papers and studies to back it up. Now, of course, the problem, again, a deeper problem of science is we know that peer review isn't perfect. We know that papers can get published even when they're garbage, and this is just becoming a bigger issue. There was a big peer-reviewed journal, the Wiley company. They had to retract 11,000 papers. It was announced just like in the last month that they're like closing down some of their journals, retracting 11,000 papers. So just think about how many of those papers might have already been quoted in other places, referred to as if they were like the science, and now they're all being deleted and taken away. But is there going to be any correction on any of those past reports that use those papers? Obviously not. So I just think that we're kind of in a, for better or worse, I would say probably for worse in the long term, in this like bifurcating, fracturing world, and maybe this was always the case prior to the internet. Like, for example, prior to the internet, people had all kinds of different opinions. It's just that we didn't necessarily see or hear each other's opinions all the time, right? Like you could have a neighbor who, believed in some crazy thing, but you would probably never hear it from them because they kept it to themselves, or unless, you got into a deep conversation. But now with social media, where we have a tendency just to put whatever comes into our mind, we post it, we tweet it, we, blog it, whatever, we put a video out, and then we all hear it and we either get offended or we agree. And so then it further like, okay, well, the people who are paying attention to this set of information about fluoride and being a problem in the IQ and all this stuff, we have these beliefs. But then the people who are following the mainstream, which didn't even, by the way, report anything about the fluoride trial, and the entire time the trial was happening and the lawsuit from the beginning has been completely ignored by the mainstream media, which is quite a feat to imagine. As you said, like this is a big thing. It's a big step. It's pretty miraculous that it even got as far as it did. It started with the petition you mentioned in 2016, and 2017 became a lawsuit. Here we are in 2024. So for 7-8 years, the mainstream has completely ignored it. So think about that. The people whose media diet involves NPR, CNN, even Fox News, and the other mainstream left and right, they have no idea this trial even exists. So when someone like you says, hey, but did you know this and that about fluoride, they're just going to be dismissive, even though we literally have a federal trial, federal courtroom with a judge right now who is still reviewing the data. He still hasn't ruled. Unfortunately, it's been February. Now we're in late June. He still hasn't made a ruling. So that's got some of us pretty worried here. But my point is, like, if people are tuned into a certain type of media, they have no idea this even exists. They have no idea. And of course, the CDC and the government is happy to ignore the story as long as possible. And of course, again, that makes some of us worry what's going on behind the scenes. Is the judge being talked to? Is he being threatened, or whatever may be going on? But I do think that's kind of a bigger problem. It impacts fluoride, but it impacts so many other scientific fields because, again, we can all be sort of coexisting in the same physical space, but if we can't even agree on basic facts, like it can get to a pretty dangerous place.
I very much agree with you. And the people, they have been doing this for so long. They have been harming themselves. And I mean, the regular citizens have been agreeing to this harming of themselves and their families and their neighbors for so long. I believe that that creates a wall where they can't say I was wrong. They have to keep clinging on to that belief that it's actually healthy because they don't want to admit to themselves that they have been harming themselves all this time, you know?
And it's also quite possible that, I mean, you know, in the beginning, when fluoride was one of the first things I started to wake up to back in 2010. In fact, it was one of the first bits of activism I ever did was printing out posters about fluoride. And this was like some old school, like InfoWars back in the day when they were not as crazy as they became, or as Jones became. And it was just this old school poster that said, there's poison in the tap water, and it had like resources for fluoridealert.org, the Fluoride Action Network. They're the ones who brought the lawsuit. And I just started going up and putting those around my neighborhood and stuff. And within a couple of days, somebody was tearing them down, and that just encouraged me further. But that was like the first thing I really dove into. And right away I could see just like, I don't know, there was these claims saying like, oh, this is the Nazi, it comes from the Nazis had it in camps, and the communists. There's no evidence of that. First of all, like if it did exist, we have no hard evidence of it. It's been lost to history, or they covered it up too good. So I tend to stay away from those kind of claims because obviously to an average person, you're just going to sound crazy, even if it is true. And again, if it is true, I followed it back to the source of it. You know, the ultimate source is some article in a newspaper that no longer exists that claims from memes and all this other places. So I tend to stay away from those claims. And I also in the beginning tended to stay away from people who are saying they're doing this to dumb us down, which like it seemed like, okay, that kind of makes sense because if it's having all these negative impacts, surely that could be the case. But like you mentioned earlier, we don't know their motives. We can't get inside their head per se. We understand a lot of these people are eugenicists, so it would make sense. But with the data we have now, I mean, it's kind of overwhelming to the point that it is harming our neurodevelopment, especially children, especially pregnant mothers. So then is it really that hard to jump to the place of say, well, maybe the people we're trying to reach might be too dumbed down already, or might be incapable of, and I don't even mean like, you know, like, oh, we're so enlightened, look at us. We all have our flaws and our blind spots. But truly, if this is affecting people's neurodevelopment and the people we're trying to reach have been being told drinking fluoride since birth is a great thing, and they've been chugging it down and they're cooking in it and all this stuff, like, I don't know. It's a very real possibility that some people might not even be able to fully comprehend the gravity of what we're trying to share with them because of the impacts of fluoride itself.
That's quite an observation, and I can't disagree with you. I mean, really, I mean, it's been in the water for what 80 years or something. It's been like that's what 3 generations, almost 4, and you know, pregnant mothers, like my mother probably drank it. Her mother was drinking it. You know, it's so anyway. I agree that that might be the case, and so you mentioned briefly there the study of pregnant mothers and IQ. Can we get into that a little bit to make sure that people hear this?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll start with, so even just as another point to make, even since the trial concluded in February, as you mentioned earlier, I went to San Francisco for 2 weeks. I was in the courtroom every day, taking notes, doing live tweeting, and I put out a few articles and did a bunch of interviews. That information you can find at the Last American Vagabond, and you can also find my video interviews with the different expert witnesses, Dr. Howard Hugh, Dr. Bruce Lanphier, and Dr. Philippe Grandjean at theconsciousresistance.com. We also have a category for fluoride that you can find there. But even since that concluded, there's more studies that have come out. So I'll just mention one that I reported on just a couple of weeks ago at the Last American Vagabond. It's titled Maternal Urinary Fluoride in Child Neural Behavior at Age 36 Months. So that's 3 years old. And this one is interesting because it's based in the United States. Some of the studies that were referenced in the fluoride lawsuit came from Mexico, from Canada, Spain, and a few other places. And that's not to say that's not relevant, but that's definitely what the U.S. government was trying to argue. Their lawyers were trying to say, look, these studies are from other places. It's not going to be the same for the U.S., even though we have some data on the U.S., but that's what makes this latest study really unique because it actually specifically followed I think it was 229 pregnant women, specifically Hispanic women, living in Los Angeles. So they followed them before their birth, and then they checked up with the babies, in the years following the birth, all the way up to 3 years old. And so, they're able to actually track the progress and the differences. And, the one thing that people should take away too is that this is the first time in U.S. history that there has been a U.S.-based cohort study that studied prenatal fluoride exposure with child neurobehavior. So like you said, they've been doing this for 80 years and they've never done a study. Like the U.S. government never commissioned a study to see what's going to happen with pregnant mothers and what happens to the babies afterwards. So that alone is kind of mind-blowing. And to your parents-in-law, your in-laws, like who think that this has all been studied, these are the kind of things that the reason I'll make this other note. The reason I write these articles is because I know this information, like myself, yourself, maybe some of the audience people are just gonna be like, yeah, I know, we've all known this, of course, fluoride's a poison. I get that, and it's easy to become jaded, but what about the people who don't know this, right? Like this is a major study in a major journal, peer-reviewed, and like I said, there are problems with peer-reviewed, but this one seems to be up to par. It's not for me and you, it's to convince the other people who are still drinking. Like this is, that's what I was saying in this article, is like we should use these types of data as fuel and sort of like ammo to reach new people, right? Because yeah, we already get it, but what about the people who aren't going to be convinced by you or me because, well, you're not a scientist, you're not a doctor, whatever. Okay, well, you're right, I'm not. But look, let me show you a study from some scientists, from some doctors who are, fit this sort of credentialist authority worship that you have, and see what you think about them. And you can read them this quote. This is from the study itself. It says, quote, "These findings suggest that there may be a need to establish recommendations for limiting exposure to fluoride from all sources during the prenatal period, a time when the developing brain is known to be especially vulnerable to injury from environmental insults." So, they go on to basically find, this is another important point, is that this study, as well as some of the others that were referenced during the trial, it's actually at levels that are recommended by the U.S. government, by the CDC. So the current recommended amount is 0.7 milligrams per liter of fluoride in water. And some of the studies, it is true, have studied levels above that. So the U.S. government tries to say, oh, well, these aren't applicable to the U.S. because they're too high. And so they don't represent, what we're actually dealing with. And I don't think that's an argument that really holds up. But okay, even if we take that argument, well, here's a study that actually is looking at the U.S. Levels at optimally fluoridated levels with children living in the 0.7 milligrams per liter. So this is at the exact dose that the CDC recommends. And again, the researchers write in another part, they say, this study sample resided in a predominantly fluoridated region and had fluoridated exposures that are typical of those living in fluoride communities in North America. So you can't say this is irrelevant. It's totally related to the actual exposure of the average person, of a pregnant mother in the United States, specifically in Los Angeles. And so they used the pregnant mother's urine samples from 2017 to 2020, and then they just studied those and looked for different biomarkers to see the presence of fluoride. And they said that here's the sort of conclusion. It says, higher prenatal fluoride exposure in Canada and or Mexico has been associated with lower IQ among children aged 3 to 4 years in Canada and children aged 6 to 12 years in Mexico. Also increased symptoms of ADHD among children aged 6 to 12 years, poor executive function among children 3 to 5 years, and poor performance on measures of global cognition for children among 12 to 24 months old in boys. So, you're talking up to 12 years old and as young as 1 to 2 years old, ADHD, lower poor executive function, lower cognitive performance on various tests, which are seen as the standard to measure cognitive. So this isn't like they're just picking some random measurements. They're using the standard tools that any other scientist that was trying to measure cognitive function would use. And then the researchers conclude, this is I think one of the stronger statements, the weight of the scientific literature supports an association of prenatal fluoride exposure with adverse child cognitive and neurobehavioral development in North America. So, and of course, the way scientists are, like they're very conservative in their language, so they're not just going to say fluoride's killing you, but they make it clear, like prenatal fluoride exposure. So that's before the baby's born, while a mom's pregnant. And I've talked about this before as well in some of my other reports. I talked to Dr. Howard, who is the expert witness, one of the expert witnesses at the trial. And he actually has a lot of experience with lead and the toxicity of lead. And the U.S. government even used his work in the past to help them develop some of the standards on lead toxicity. So this is not just some crackpot scientist. This is somebody who the U.S. government, the EPA, has used his work before. And he's warning specifically about how pregnant mothers are being impacted, because not only obviously the mom's got the baby in her, so she's having to eat more, drink more, and stuff like that. And if she's drinking fluoridated water, well, she's going to be drinking even more when she's pregnant. She's getting thirstier. So they've shown that as the pregnancy progresses, her intake of water is also going to increase. So by the time she gets to the third trimester, she's chugging a lot of water. You know, if you've been around a pregnant mom, they get thirsty. You know, they need a lot, and they need to nourish the baby. But at the same time, it's already been shown that the fluoride, it does pass through the blood-brain barrier. So it's going into the placenta where the baby is at, through the placenta into the baby's blood-brain barrier. And Dr. Howard, who also made the point that one of the things about fluoride, one of the reasons it can cause skeletal fluorosis, it can cause knee problems, hip problems, arthritis, etc., is because fluoride, it displaces calcium in the bones and it stores in your bones. So if you're just chugging a bunch of fluoride or you're getting exposed to it, it does lead to this thing called skeletal fluorosis, where you can have like your bones and joints can start to become misshapen or just constantly in pain and things like that. And so the fluoride is displacing the calcium and causing all these harms. But think about this: when the baby is starting to form, it's coming from a little fetus into a human body. It has to pull everything it can from the mother. It doesn't, it gets nothing else but what the mother gives it. And typically in a pregnancy, the baby will start to pull from the mom's calcium in her bones to form its own skeletal structure. But if the mother's calcium has largely been replaced with fluoride, the baby's going to pull all that fluoride right into its body. So as it's taking calcium and whatever else it needs to form its own skeletal structure, it's also just absorbing that fluoride right into it. So it's going to be coming in through the mother's bones. It's going to be coming in through whatever water she's drinking. If she's also eating processed foods, which often contain fluoridated water in them, and other, of course, processed foods has its own issues, but most processed foods and canned goods, unless they specifically say that they contain filtered water, they have fluoridated water in them. So you just have to think of all this intake that the mother's getting. And then, of course, we mentioned, like, if she's cooking noodles, if she's making coffee, whatever it may be, all that stuff's fluoridated. It's going directly into the baby's body. And then as studies like this are showing, as well as many others, and the National Toxicology Program report that you mentioned that has been suppressed by the U.S. government, show that this is leading to lower IQ in children, to poor cognitive development. And what does that look like in the long term? I mean, like, we've been doing this for 80 years, for generations now. And this is why I was alluding to the fact that maybe some people are, I don't want to say dumbed down, but definitely they've been impacted. Let's say they've been impacted. And so that could be impacting not only just their daily health. People might have joint problems, bone problems, and they have no idea why. They never think that, oh, maybe it's the water I'm drinking, but also brain fog, things like that could all be related to the fluoride intake that people have.
Very well said. You said earlier that you tried to shy away from the claim that they're dumbing us down, but this is proof that they're dumbing us down. I mean, it's like...
It's hard to ignore at this point.
Right. So also, like, the baby is absorbing the fluoride into its little bones, but those bones that the baby has is where it makes its red blood cells. The bones are an important part of that baby's body, and it becomes cemented there in the bone. Like, it stays there. It's not like stored in fat cells where it can be burned off and, like, cleaned out of the body. It's like, it's calcifies, right?
Absolutely, it calcifies. And the crazy thing about this is actually something I learned. Like I said, I've been researching fluoride for about 14 years, but there's always more room to learn because there's just more data coming out. I learned by being at the trial through Dr. Philippe Grandjean, who is a Danish scientist. And again, he's one of, like, the lead scientific experts on the world on toxicity, specifically on mercury, and his work was also used by the U.S. government. So again, like, the Fluoride Action Network, I think, did an amazing job of finding experts who the government couldn't just be like, oh, those are crazy people. It's like, no, you use their work. You've literally used their science to develop your own standards. So if you listen to them about mercury, you listen to them about lead, why wouldn't you listen to them about these other areas, right? But Dr. Philippe Grandjean, he tells a story of there's another scientist back in the 1930s. His name was Kai Roham. He's from Denmark, and he went to Greenland where they have these, I think it's called cryolite. It's basically a mineral, and they're out there mining it. But one of the byproducts of cryolite mining is exposure to fluoride. So there was all these cryolite workers, these mine workers going there, and they're spending tens and dozens of hours a day exposing themselves to fluoride. This Kai Roham goes and studies them. He does like skeletal studies, he does x-rays, he does all kinds of stuff. And he described in his book, he wrote this book in 1936, I think, how their rib cages, he said that like it looked like it was like a marble, like they had become so hardened that he couldn't even see through them. And so he was the first scientist to discover and to name skeletal fluorosis. So think about that. 90 years ago, there's a scientist writing about this, writing about the exposure to fluoride and how it could lead to skeletal problems. And then we've learned even more since then. But that to me is just, it's so infuriating and frustrating that that book exists out there. You can find a Wikipedia page about him. He's not a conspiracy theorist. He's definitely seen kind of like held in high standards in Denmark as a very credible, intelligent scientist who did a lot of good work. And how many Americans have ever heard of that guy or heard of the book or heard of his 1930s research on skeletal fluorosis proving that exposure to fluoride could cause all kinds of damage to your skeletal structure. And that's not even getting into the kidney problems, the liver problems, because that was discussed at the trial that, like, just as one example, if somebody's on dialysis, if they've got diabetes and other things, and they're already having to watch their intake of foods because of, we know the liver processes everything, the kidneys process things. Well, that person, typically people who already have like kidney issues, they're having to drink more water on a regular basis already to kind of help themselves flush things out. But again, if that's fluoridated water, well, then they're increasing this exposure to this toxin in their body, and that's going to lead to even more problems. And so until we can get the mainstream or more people just on their own to accept that fluoride is a problem, people are going to keep trying to do things that they think are helping themselves, like, hey, drink water. We all know water is good for you. It's necessary, right? Water is life. But it's not just that simple. The type of water you're drinking does matter. And, that gets into a whole nother topic where people talk about structured water and clean water and all these other things. But the point is, at the very least, you need to be doing reverse osmosis to pull out all the nasty crap like fluoride, to at least get you to that point where you're not poisoning yourself on a daily basis. And it's just, like I said, it's just infuriating the fact that this information is out there. And it's, people like us can be called crazy. I can go spend 2 weeks in San Francisco and report on this trial and still go out into the mainstream and have people tell me that I'm a conspiracy theorist because they've never even heard of the trial.
Well, you're doing God's work, man. Keep it up. Keep up the good work. It's ironic that your teeth are bones. Like, your teeth are bones. How can dentists claim it protects your teeth when it's proven that it caused skeletal fluorosis? Like, it's the opposite of the truth. And even in this current trial, the government was trying to claim with one study that that fluoride in prenatal women caused babies to have an increase of IQ by like 25% or something. Wouldn't that be great? Like, my kid can be a genius. All I got to do is pump toxins into his brain, right? Is that true? Like,
that study is insane. Honestly, that's a Spanish study done by this Dr. Ibarliza, I believe is his name, and I think that Michael Conant, who's the lead attorney for the Fluoride Action Work during the trial, he did a great job just kind of eviscerating that study. And even the judge, despite the fact that it's been February, March, April, May, June, so it's been 4 going on 5 months now since all the arguments have been made, all the documents been given to the judge. We're just waiting on his ruling. Despite that, I will say that throughout my time there, the judge seemed to be as fair as you would expect or want a judge. I have my problems with the legal system and judicial system, obviously. But if we're going to have that system and you have these judges that are supposed to be as objective as possible, I think he did a good job. Like, he definitely wasn't clearly biased towards the government, and he wasn't clearly biased towards the Fluoride Action Network. He wanted to hear the science. And, think about this. For one, like, this trial is historic for a number of reasons. You mentioned earlier that the Toxic Substance Control Act, or TSCA. It's the law that allows people to petition the U.S. government. This is the first time that a petition has successfully made it to a federal court. So that makes it historic on its own. But then obviously it's about fluoride being, and evidence is being presented, was presented in court for the first time in history. So that makes it a big thing. But the other element is that the judicial system, judges and lawyers, et cetera, typically don't judge science. Science is kind of considered separately from that. And in fact, I'm sure there are some scientists who hate this and like, what does this judge know? He shouldn't be in there ruling on this and that. But the judge is an intelligent guy. He's actually has a constitutional background, and we'll see how much that helps. But he was clearly trying to understand it. He wasn't just taking anybody's word. He would pause them, even to the point where it's like, oh my God, this is getting mind numbing. Why are they going so over this over and over? But the judge was literally like, okay, can you explain that to me again before we go further? How does this thing work? Because it was really I guess you could say just like a master class, like a quick learning to be able to even keep up with the trial. And I follow this stuff pretty closely, but I had to, lace myself up pretty quick, because they're saying point of departure, margin of exposure, this thing, like, a lot of different terms that if you don't understand those terms, then you're not going to understand what they're even referring to. And so the judge had to stop them different times and say, okay, could you explain that to me deeper? How does this relate to this? And what does this specific thing mean? And so I think he was doing his best to understand it and to really try to get to the bottom of it. We'll see how that all plays in the end. But even in court, the judge seemed totally skeptical of the study you mentioned, that this single study out of all the other, because, there's studies that the government tried to point to that say, look, this one says some boys were affected, but some girls weren't. So we can't tell, it's a wash. There's no way to know the difference. But then they have this one study that says 25-point IQ increase, like a 25-point, like no other study has ever claimed that in the history of fluoride studies. And definitely, even for them to feel so bold to like go that big, like it didn't even say like, hey, look, according to this study, we know it's kind of odd, but it said it increases a couple of IQ points. No, they claim 25 IQ point increase, which is pretty massive on the scale of how they measure IQ. So that one was ultimately, I think, laughed out of the room. I don't think the government even really took that seriously. At the end of the day, it seemed like their goal was to try to confuse and cloud the judge's judgment as much as possible, because if they can because the whole thing is like, he has to be able to say, like, beyond a benefit of a doubt, I can prove with these different data, like fluoride is a neurotoxin. That's really what he has to prove. That's the only thing that matters in this particular case. That's why they were focused on the IQ point. And if the government could confuse the hell out of him and say, well, look, we got one that says 25 IQ points, one that says everything's fine, and okay, they got some bad ones over there. But as you can see, it's also confusing, Judge. There's no way to determine what's what. So let's just keep studying it and we'll figure it out later. That's basically what they were trying to get him to do, is like, let's keep kicking the can down the road. We'll do more studies. We'll do more tests. But again, the judge did seem to recognize the severity of his task, which is kind of why it's frustrating he's taking so long, because at the trial he said, I fully understand that while I continue to learn, there are people right now drinking fluoride and there are people being impacted by this right now. So it's kind of like, doing nothing isn't helping either. So, but yeah, that study was just a complete joke. I don't think anybody takes it seriously. And I think that that's an example probably of how quickly some studies can get published. I think they rushed that study out as quick as possible just so the government could use it in the trial. And, it doesn't seem to hold up to scientific scrutiny.
Well, that makes sense. And it is reassuring that you find from your personal analysis of what the judge, his actions and his words, that he's a thinking man, at least. And if he is a thinking man, then he will come to the conclusion that we also have come to. I mean, you are a thinking man, I as well. It's obvious that it's a poison, and even at
seems pretty obvious, huh?
Right. Even at 0.7, like per liter, that 0.07 or whatever, that is a small amount in quotes or whatever. And they did studies on different amounts. And even that, they're trying to say, oh, that study can't be used because it's a different number. It's not 0.07. So like they're throwing out all this obvious stuff. And then the judge has to have a narrow bandwidth of view in this trial, but the confusing and clouding his judgment, that seems to be the same strategy that they've been doing to us in the public and in the sphere of the news and, you know, the media, like that's what they do. They confuse us, they cloud our judgment, they say it's just too complicated, guys. Just, you know, and then we throw up our hands, say, oh well, learned helplessness, and then they win effectively because all they're trying to do is just continue fluoridating. You know that, so it's not like if they win, they can go continue fluoridate. They're already doing it. So just by kicking the can down the road, that is a win for them. And I'm glad that the judge recognizes that. And he's taking the reins and saying, okay, well, let's look at this draft report that, you know, instead of what was blocked, the full report by Rachel Levine, the dude there that helped block the report with the emails and the FOIA requests that was released. You know, they blocked the release of this study to the judge, in effect making it so that the can would be kicked down the road indefinitely, right?
Absolutely. I mean, that's a big part. I'm glad you mentioned the emails. This is, to me, one of the, I mean, if we lived in a different world, this would be front page news everywhere. It would have been one of the biggest scandals of 2023, you know, 2022 when the emails came out. Unfortunately, that's not where we're at. And I was probably one of the few people reporting on this in addition to just the Fluoride Action Network. So as part of the lawsuit, you get discovery, and this means you're able to ask for all kinds of documentation, and you're able to file open records requests. And so they've been doing that for years now, just getting all kinds of documents. They proved numerous things, one of them being that we know that even more than we already did before, that the U.S. government agencies that are supposed to protect people's health and specifically relating to fluoride, that they have very close relationships with the American Dental Association, who is a huge advocate for fluoridation, obviously, because they, like you said earlier, they want to keep people drinking it or putting it on their teeth or whatever. And that is even I'll say even in that area, because there are some people who are like, yeah, fluoride's a poison, we shouldn't be drinking it, but you know, it's still good for teeth. Even that's questionable. There's been no real good hard data in the last 80 years proving that. They did some studies back in, I think it was Grand Rapids, Michigan originally, and actually in Jersey and a few other places that they still use to this day to say, look, see, these studies from the 40s show that fluoride can decrease cavities and things like that. That's up for question as well. That hasn't even been proven well, but that's what the ADA continues to say. So they're like, okay, well, water fluoridation is technically a separate thing, but they understand that if people start questioning water fluoridation, then they're going to start questioning what the dentist is putting in their mouth. So the ADA is a huge lobby for this. And so we learned about that. We learned that while the U.S. government was trying to keep this report from the National Toxicology Program from coming out, they were actually sharing draft reports of it with the ADA before the public even seen it. So obviously there's a really strong relationship there. But the other big bombshell is the one that you mentioned, that there are emails that specifically note that this NTP, what's called a monograph, it's basically a systematic review of all the different fluoride literature out there. And the NTP is housed under the NIH, all the National Institutes of Health, all the U.S. Health agencies. It's one of these many bureaucracies there. And it does have a lot of leading scientists, toxicologists, and others who seem to be experts in their field. And honestly, I think that they have been trying to do their job. It's just that there's been interference. So they were tasked with doing this systematic review. And they, as far back as 2016, were already starting to show that they believed fluoride was a neurotoxin. We were starting to get early reports of that. Well, what we found out through the emails that came out in the lawsuit was that by May 2022, the scientists at the NTP said that their report was finished, it was concluded, and they were ready to release it. And the conclusion of that report was that fluoride exposure to children lowers IQ, that fluoride exposure through pregnant mothers and through children at a young age will lead to a reduction of IQ points and a reduction in cognitive function. Like their language was very clear, and they did a whole thing. Well, the public, we didn't know anything about this, and we wouldn't know anything about it if it wasn't for this lawsuit being able to get those emails, because in those emails, you can see the CDC's oral health division, which again, it relates to the dentists, as well as other agencies within the NIH starting to communicate privately. Once the NTP scientists said, we're ready to release our publication, I think it was May 18th, 2022, they said, we're going to post it on our servers and do our usual process. all of a sudden this chatter starts happening within other agencies saying, we can't let this report come out. This isn't going to see the light of day. And as you mentioned, there is an email that specifically says that Assistant Secretary of Health Rachel or Richard Levine, depending on your preference, said this is not coming out. And so they're a high-level figure there. And there are other people who are mentioned, Richard Wojcik, who's another director of the NTP. What essentially seems like is that it came down from Rachel Levine and maybe even higher above them. But then once it started to get exposed, because I was reporting on it, one or two other places were, Richard Wojcik, the NTP director, he basically claimed that it was his fault. It's like, what I think happened is if your boss gets caught doing something, your boss doesn't want to take credit for it. So they probably said like, hey, you got to take credit for this. So Richard Wojcik, he then put out a statement saying, I'm the one who intervened. This report isn't ready. And, the other thing that we got through these emails, and I've written articles about this, The Last American Vagabond, not only did we get those emails that mentioned that this report was blocked, but another big kind of history-making thing we got was a preview into the peer review process. Some of these emails actually show, so they have the NTP draft, and you can see in red, like the anonymous peer reviewers making comments saying, hey, we think this needs to be updated, this and that. And then you can see the comments back from the scientists from the NTP. And so it really is a window into the peer review process that we typically don't ever see. But what's really interesting about this is you could see that the NTP scientists were continuously standing up for their work. Every time that these anonymous peer reviewers would say, hey, how about we update this language? Essentially, they just kept trying to get them to water down the language in any way they could and say, they're claiming you guys are too confident fluoride is going to lower IQ. We should add it could, or just all these qualifying words. And like I was saying, you could see in the references, you could see the scientists saying, we stand by our conclusions. This doesn't seem necessary, just different notes. And again, that's not making the public, but it shows to me these scientists clearly stand by their work and they're trying to defend their work. But unfortunately, the final version of this report still hasn't been released to this day. The only reason we even know about it again is because of this lawsuit. And through the lawsuit, the judge did say that the NTP draft version, which was supposed to come out in May 2022, could be released as part of the lawsuit. But if you were to go to the NTP's website right now, it's got like a big warning label basically saying this is a draft report. It's not to be taken as science. This shouldn't be used to inform any public policy, health decisions, et cetera. So it's like they know it's out, but since it's not the final version of the report, they can kind of claim, well, that's not really what we believe yet. And who knows if it will ever come out. At this point, it doesn't seem like there's ever going to be a final version of this report. And the lawsuit obviously is still kind of, we're waiting for the ruling. But my point is that information should be everywhere. You have a U.S. government official at the highest levels of the health divisions intervening to block another agency of the U.S. government report that concludes that fluoride lowers IQ in children, and the scientists continue to stand by their work, and the report is still not out almost 3 years later. Like, that should be everywhere. And so I've tried to do my best to get that information out there, because I know that following the story can kind of be difficult for some people. It's not just a simple, easy headline. But at the end of the day, I guess the simple headline is fluoride is a poison, and the U.S. government continues to cover it up.
Yeah, that's perfect, man. I just one more thing before we go. What, besides all of the toxic nature of fluoride, do you think it's a violation that the government is medicating the people at all? Can you just speak to that real quick? Because I know you're an anarchist, and I understand that that you know the truth, and I want you to say it for my listeners, please.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, what I've always told people is that I see three main arguments against fluoride. Now, there's the obvious health arguments we've been discussing, and that should be like enough. I feel like, okay, that's all you need, right, is the health arguments. But unfortunately, I've learned over the years that some people don't even care about their health, so sometimes that's not enough. But you've got the health argument that, hey, this is a poison, it's causing harm, and even if, let's say that the government's claims are correct, that 0.7 is quote unquote safe, and it's only at higher levels. Well, typically in science, you're going to use the precautionary principle. You're going to think about the most vulnerable person. So even if you say, well, look, it seems like harm starts at 1.1 milligram per liter, not 0.7, well, that's not that far apart. So you would want to take a precautionary principle and say, let's just get rid of it just to make sure we're not harming the most vulnerable population, right? So that's the health argument. Then you have, you can make environmental arguments. The fluoride is a byproduct of toxic aluminum waste, and they're throwing it in the water. Instead of these companies having to find a way to properly dispose of this, cities around the United States pay millions of dollars for them to dump it in the water. So you got those arguments. And then there is the general civil liberties, freedom of choice argument that this is a forced medication. You know, every person should have the ability to choose what they put in their body. If you want to drink fluoride, there are fluoride tablets. You can go to the dentist to do that. You can buy fluoridated water if you like. You can buy fluoridated toothpaste, right? But why not just not include it in the water so that the person at home, the families, the individuals can make their own choices and decide if you want to go buy fluoride, add it to your water, do that. If you want to buy the fluoride drinks, do that. But at least we're all kind of starting off with like, there's no poison in the water. I mean, that makes the most sense. So I think that whatever way you take it, like there's just no good reason. But ultimately, I do think, yeah, you should have the freedom to poison yourself with fluoride if you want. And I should have the freedom to not do that. But both of our choices are taken away by the government mandating it and then using, like I know for sure in Houston, I don't know about other places, but in Houston, literally when you pay your water bill, that water bill fund goes to the fluoride fund. So by paying your water bill, you're funding the fluoride fund, and then it goes back in your water and it's poisoning you. So you're paying for your own poisoning in this, and we should at the very least have a choice. You know, that to me is just, it's a basic common sense thing that I think a lot of us can get. But this is just another way, as you know, man, that like the government tries to play mommy and daddy and say, hey, well, we need to take care of everybody. And this goes back to the original reasoning for this. This was in Grand Rapids. They were saying, like, as the U.S. was still mainly rural in the 40s and 50s, as things, you know, more people started to move into the suburbs and cities, but there was still a lot of people in the rural countrysides. And so the argument was, you know, who's going to worry about the poor people in the country? They don't have access to dental care. They're, you know, they don't have good toothpaste access and things like that. Okay, well then instead of, I don't know, subsidizing toothpaste or something like that, they said, let's just dump this thing in the water. And that way, everybody, regardless of whether they're poor or rich, they'll have fluoride in the water, and they claim that it's good for cavities. But of course, that doesn't make any sense because people aren't just swishing fluoride and spitting it out. They're drinking it. So they claim, okay, well, when you drink it, it washes over your teeth and you get the added benefit. But what about after that, when it goes down my throat and it goes over my organs and it goes into my body, you know? So it all comes back from that original thing again, like the government's here to save us. What about the poor people? What about the children? You know, if we don't put fluoride in the water, there's going to be cavities everywhere. And to me, that just goes back to, we need more individual personal responsibility. People need to take care of themselves. Not to say we couldn't have community interdependence and things of that sort, but if you are outsourcing your own health to the government, well, guess what? You're going to get lower IQ. You're going to get fluoride in the water. You're going to get vaccines, things like that.
Man, that's perfectly said. Thank you so much. And so I wanted to share with the listeners before you go here that they can find all of this information. Oh, 1 second. Let me share it with everybody. Okay. They can find all of this information at thelastamericanvagabond.com/category/health/fluoride-trial. And this here is all of your information that you have gathered and put forth. And thank you for Ryan Christian for giving you a platform to publish all of this work. And here, go ahead if you want to say something.
I was just going to say, yeah, absolutely to Ryan and to T-Lab, because you know, the whole fluoride trip that I made was completely crowdfunded. So, you know, this is what it takes to do real on the ground journalism. I'm not a rich guy. I'm just an independent journalist, and I get paid through viewers and listeners. And thankfully, through Ryan and what he's built, I'm able to do journalism like this. And yeah, I mean, that just so everybody understands, like, the mainstream's not going to cover it. So people like me have to do that. And that takes time and money. It took me to fly to San Francisco. I had to get a hotel. I had to eat. I had to do all these things. The trip cost about $4,000 just to go there, be there in expensive San Francisco for 2 weeks and, eat and survive and have the energy to keep doing this. So I'm grateful to Ryan, and I'm grateful to all our viewers at T-Lab who helped allow that to happen.
That's great. I was watching that as it was happening, and I was so glad to see that it was funded so quickly and people care so much to hear your work. And that's wonderful. And that is another thing I'd like to say. How can people donate now to your work going forward? And this I'm sharing now, theconsciousresistance.com is your main website with all of your work. And is there a place here where we can donate?
I appreciate that. Thank you so much for that, brother. Yeah, theconsciousresistance.com/invest has links to my Substack where people can sign up for monthly support, my Buy Me a Coffee. I also have a P.O. box if people want to send things in the mail. And then I do take crypto as well. So all that info is at theconsciousresistance.com/invest.
Fantastic. Derrick, thank you so much for sharing your time and your attention with us today. And I hope all of the viewers visit consciousresistance.com and follow your work and share this information with everybody that they know and that drinks water, right? Every human. Just thank you again, and I appreciate everything that you do.
Hey, thank you for having me on. I really do appreciate it. Keep it up, man. And thanks everybody for listening. I look forward to just continuing this fight with you all.
Wonderful. Cheers, Derrick. Thank you again. And thank you, listeners, for listening. We will see you next time on Wake the Dead.
Over half the localities in Virginia treat their drinking water with fluoride because fluoride is said to reduce the chance of tooth decay. It's also a popular ingredient in toothpaste. More fluoride, proponents claim, means fewer cavities. But a number of scientists and consumer groups across the country are urging a re-examination of fluoride. Their claim that the chemical does not prevent cavities, but does promote cancer.
It's causing in the area, again, minimum figures of 20 or 30 cancer deaths per day in the United States that can be attributed to public water fluoridation.
Dr. John Yamayunas, a biochemist, heads the National Safe Water Foundation. He says fluoride does far more harm than good.
We used to sell snake oils in the 1800s. And in the 1900s, I guess it's been fluoride has been our big snake oil.
But the president of the Virginia Dental Association says fluoride is a proven cavity fighter.
But if individuals at an early age and during childhood have the opportunity of drinking fluoridated water, it even lessens the decay that is caused by the concentrated carbohydrates.
Fluoride opponents asked a legislative committee to ban the chemical from the state's water systems, but the request was denied unanimously. Their best hope now is a state-funded study on fluoride's benefits or dangers. In Richmond, Joel Rubin, The Daily News.
Michigan, a town becoming widely known to dentists and municipal authorities against tooth decay. The children in Grand Rapids have less tooth decay than they did 6 years ago, as much as 65% less. Grand Rapids' fight against tooth decay started in January 1945 when fluoride was added to the water supply. This was done as part of a study to determine the effect of fluoridation on tooth decay. Participating in the study are city officials, dentists, Michigan State Department of Health, University of Michigan, and the U.S. Public Health Service. After 6 years of fluoridation, the study shows that the 6-year-old children who drank the water from birth had 65% less tooth decay. The 7-year-olds, 45% less, and so on. Even the 16-year-olds who started drinking the water when they were 10 years old received some benefits, 16% less tooth decay. 16 years after fluoridation, all children 16 years old and under will have 65% less tooth decay. Studies in Newburgh, New York, Sheboygan, Wisconsin, Marshall, Texas, Lewiston, Idaho, Brantford, Ontario, and other cities show substantially the same results as those obtained at Grand Rapids. Other studies show the benefits of fluoridation will last throughout life. Most of the many communities now fluoridating add sodium silica fluoride or sodium fluoride to their water. Another compound also used is hydrofluorosilicic acid. All three are effective and cheap. In a town of 5,000 population, the daily amount of the fluoride compound used and its cost is sodium silica fluoride, 7 pounds, cost 49 cents. Sodium fluoride, 10 pounds, cost $1.20. Hydrofluorosilicic acid, about 2 gallons, $1.61. In selecting one of the three compounds, the size of the town and its water plant facilities are considered. 3 types of feeders are used to add fluoride compounds. One is the solution feeder, used in towns up to about 20,000 population. Another type is the volumetric feeder, a dry feeder for towns of from 1,000 to 120,000. The third type is the gravimetric feeder, for feeding the dry compound in cities of more than 120,000. All 3 feeders, the solution feeder, the volumetric feeder, and the gravimetric, are equipped with automatic controls and have long been used for adding chemicals to city water supplies. Generally, the fluoride content of the water is determined by the colorimetric test. In this test, a color indicator is added to water samples. The color of the samples is then matched with the color of standards containing known amounts of fluoride. Dentists in many cities are helping to bring the benefits of fluoridation to children. Now, our children can have better health through fluoridated water. They can drink away tomorrow's tooth decay, have more attractive teeth. The cost is about 10 cents a year per person. Fluoridation is endorsed by the American Dental Association, State and Territorial Dental Health Directors, American Association of Public Health Dentists, Public Health Service, Federal Security Agency, State and Territorial Health Officers, American Public Health Association, and the American Medical Association.